the day Hitler and Goebbels lost their credibility with the German people. September 30, 1941. After a 2-month pause, Army Group Center under the command of Marshal Bock resumes its offensive in the direction of Moscow, with the intention of capturing the city and dealing the final blow to the Soviet government. This new offensive, in which the German High Command placed all its hopes, began in the best possible way, and in just a few days, managed to surround more than 500,000 Soviet soldiers in the Vyazma and Bryansk pockets. Because it took place in the month of October, the Germans were worried about the arrival of the rain and cold, which everyone knew was coming. The rains would cause the entire operation to be paralyzed because it would be impossible to continue advancing with the fields and roads turned into mudflats. However, and luckily for them, during the first days of October, the weather was very good in that area of Russia, which, together with the new large pockets of enemy troops, filled Hitler and his generals with hope. With the entire country with its eyes fixed on Russia, and with a burning desire for the war to end and his relatives to finally return home, Hitler let himself be carried away by emotion and gave a great speech at the Sports Palace in Berlin. This speech took place on October 3rd, and was the first time that the German leader addressed the nation since he had begun the campaign in Russia. In this speech he said that Russia was already practically destroyed, and that the announcement of definitive victory would come in the coming days. Furthermore, he commented that Germany was invincible, and had the ability to defeat all possible enemies, no matter how many billions they were going to spend. This was clearly a warning to the United States of America. This was the announcement that all Germans were waiting for, because after 3.5 months of fighting in Russia, which had claimed hundreds of thousands of victims, many were wondering when that campaign was going to end, which they were told would end in 6 weeks. On October 5th, Goebbels wrote in his diary, "Internally, the Führer's speech has worked wonderfully. All the criticism, all the pessimism, even all the anxiety have completely disappeared." Although this announcement was made as soon as the German attack on Moscow began, it was just a few days later, when the pockets in Vyazma and Bryansk were being closed, that the German leaders decided to take the next step. Thus, if Hitler's speech at the Sports Palace in Berlin was nothing more than a harangue to motivate the nation, what happened during the days of October 9th to 10th was the great official announcement. On October 7th, the head of the Wehrmacht's Operations Department, Colonel General Alfred Jodl, proclaimed that the siege of Vyazma had been closed, and that they were experiencing the most decisive moment of the Eastern Front campaign. Furthermore, both Keitel and Marshal von Bock, who was the commander of Army Group Center, assured that after this new victory, they only had a quiet march to Moscow. If the weather remained good, it wouldn't take them too long to complete their final objective. However, and as we will see below, although everything seemed to be going well, the truth was that everything was about to change radically. Thus, it was on October 8, 1941 when everything changed on the Eastern Front, and the unusual period of good weather for the date came to an end. One of Bock's subordinate generals noted the following in his diary. "He has started to get very cold. Heavy snowfall with a blizzard coming from the north. No type of operation is possible in this disgusting time." Another soldier commented, "We had problems with the first snow, and when it started to melt, the so-called roads became a mere swamp. From here on, it rained and continued to rain without stopping, making the problem worse and worse." And finally, a report from the 47th Panzer Corps indicated that all movements were suffering severe delays due to the poor condition of the roads. Furthermore, it indicated that the column's pace had to be reduced to just 2 kilometers per hour. While this was taking place at the front, on October 9 Hitler met with Otto Dietrich, who was the Third Reich's press chief, and they had a conversation about the announcement Dietrich was about to make. Dietrich later commented that Hitler was very happy and joyful due to the good news coming from the Eastern Front. As Dietrich had to give a press conference during that afternoon of October 9, in which members of the German press, as well as those of all the Allied and other neutral countries, would be present, Hitler dictated to Dietrich word for word what he had to say. In this way and with his prepared speech, This very important event took place on the afternoon of October 9th, in which members of the national and international press were gathered. The last remnants of the Soviet armies facing Moscow are trapped in 2 rings of steel and are being destroyed by the Wehrmacht. Dietrich began by saying, "To the east of the positions we have just taken, there is nothing but undefended territory. The campaign in the east has been decided after the crushing of Timoshenko's armies." The reaction of the journalists was on the one hand one of absolute joy for the German correspondents, and one of astonishment and doubt among the international ones. The next day, October 10th, the entire German press announced big headlines with the following statements. "The great hour has arrived. The campaign in the east is decided. The entire Soviet front has collapsed." And finally, another newspaper announced that the Russian campaign had ended. Some European leaders, such as Francisco Franco, sent a telegram to Hitler congratulating him on his victory. "In my name and on behalf of the Spanish people, I send Your Excellency my most enthusiastic congratulations for the final victory of the glorious German Wehrmacht over the enemy of civilization." All this positive news, that they were selling the bear skin before finishing hunting it, made Goebbels start to get nervous. The German minister knew that this would make a deep impression both internationally and domestically, raising the stakes and putting the prestige of the entire German government at risk. Because of this, Goebbels noted the following: "I hope to God that the military operations develop in such a way that we do not have to suffer any psychological setback." Thus, if during the next few weeks the definitive victory over the Soviet Union was not obtained, Goebbels knew that the entire credibility of the government would be called into question, and the population would distrust them forever. On the other hand, on the Eastern Front the soldiers who had begun to suffer all the first snows, frosts, and immense mudflats did not take this news very well. One of them, after hearing that the victory had already been announced in Germany, wrote the following: "I put my hands to my head. How is this possible? Have our leaders gone crazy overnight? All of this is not true, it cannot be true, all of us who are here see very clearly what is happening. Do these gentlemen have blindfolds?" After the enormous positive and negative feelings that this news provoked, Goebbels noted on October 11th that they had gotten into serious trouble. Many people now thought that the war in the East was already over, and that the Soviet Union was just hours away from capitulating. This was something that had to be solved, because as Goebbels well knew, the reality was very different. With this objective, it was ordered to radically modify the headlines of the news that were broadcast in Germany, and the change came during the following day, this being October 12th. In this way, the newspapers stopped talking about the fact that victory had already been obtained, but commented that military operations continued their course to obtain victory. As we have just said, many soldiers fighting on the front took this game quite badly, and there were those who dared to make fun of the leaders of the German government and their methods. On the other hand, the civilian population, who could do nothing but rely on the government's news programs to know the evolution of the war, lost interest in the Eastern Front, since they thought that everything had ended. How were they going to react if the bad news came back again? What would happen if they began to inform them of new dead relatives? To try to correct this error, the written press and the news programs gradually recovered their usual format, in which they talked about the evolution of the new battles, as if the announcement of the victory over Russia had never occurred. Generally, the news focused on the advance being made on Moscow. However, and due to the great quagmire that Western Russia had become, progress was increasingly slower, and everything indicated that the German offensive on Moscow would end up stalling. At the end of the month, Hitler and Goebbels had a conversation about this matter, and while the German leader was still very enthusiastic and very positive, Goebbels was increasingly negative and realistic. Finally, the German propaganda minister noted that the most sensible thing would be to assume that the campaign in Russia would not be able to end during that year, and that it would have to wait until the following year to conclude it. For his part, Hitler commented that the arrival of the cold would cause the ground to freeze, and with this the final blow could be given to the Russians. After having this conversation, Goebbels' anxiety only increased, since he was aware that the Führer's expectations of him could not be met. This would cause his prestige and reputation to fall to the ground, and he found himself suffering the same fate as Hermann Göring. Because they did not want to cause fear in the population, the news continued to be very positive, and it seemed that victory was getting closer. This once again caused great indignation among the soldiers, who did not understand how their leaders were capable of making such announcements. In relation to this matter, one of the lieutenants of the 11th Panzer Division said the following: "For weeks they have been spreading the word in Germany that we had already won the war. They should come here and take a look for themselves. If they had an idea of the hardships we are experiencing on the front, they would not dare say such nonsense." The tough battles continued throughout the month of November, in which the German army gradually approached its objectives. Once this small mud season had passed with the arrival of an increasingly intense cold, the Germans tried to reach Moscow. Finally, all hopes ended in early December, when the Soviets, far from being defeated, launched numerous offensives along the entire Eastern Front. This was the hardest blow that Germany had suffered to date, and the trust that the population and the army had in their leaders was seriously affected. Paul Schmidt, who was the chief interpreter of Foreign Minister Ribbentrop, made the following observation, which perfectly summarizes the progressive change of headlines that German propaganda made. "Instead of having won the war, people began to say that we were going to win the war." Finally, the message continued to evolve until it was announced that we were fighting a war that we could not lose. Well, once we have seen this, and before finishing the program, let's see how Hitler made this mistake again the following year during the Battle of Stalingrad. This took place on November 9, 1942, coinciding with the anniversary of the attempted coup d'état that had been carried out in Munich in 1923. In said intervention, Hitler announced that the German army had taken Stalingrad, and that therefore, the battle had come to an end. This announcement was made after the German leader had been pressuring Paulus for weeks to send all his troops to conquer Stalingrad, and after many efforts he had managed to occupy 90% of the city. Thus, once again it was believed that the Soviets were defeated, and the 1942 campaign was going to end with a great victory. However, just a few days later, the Red Army launched what was known as Operation Uranus, which ended up pocketing the German 6th Army in Stalingrad by November 23. Once again, the blow to German morale was devastating, since they went from saying that the city had been taken, and therefore the campaign had been won, to announcing 2 months later that the entire German 6th Army had been annihilated at Stalingrad. So, what did you think of the program? How is it possible that the propaganda services of the Third Reich made the same mistake twice? If you want to analyze how the German attack on the Soviet Union evolved, I leave you the program we have on this matter in the description.